everything starts on a community level, and the community affects the product. The product will eventually bring change, and the change will lead to a better system. So everything ties in with each other about starting from who we are. Yeah.
Hey, this is sugahoneybbt, a podcast aimed to amplify Asian women voices through critical thinking and meaningful conversations. And this is the part 2 on male emotions and vulnerability with my dear friend Ryan. So if you haven't heard the first part from last week, you can go listen to that first. I don't know what else to tell you. I'm your host, Ange, and it's just me today again. So before we start today's episode, I keep saying this, follow us on Instagram at sugahoneybbt, sugahoneybbt. And also, leave a 5-star review for us on Apple Podcasts. I'm going to do this really quick. And then PayPal, Patreon is the best way to subscribe and get some perks from us.
Hit that like button.
That just came out of nowhere. So anyways, that was Ryan, my dear friend who's super talented, and that you've heard from him last week. And last week we touched on a bunch of stuff. We touched on, being born Asian but grew up with Western influence, and how emotions and vulnerabilities mean to you, and, how the culture and race plays into that. And, why men aren't taught emotions, or how does the masculine gender norm, traditional gender norms affects women, etc. It's just good stuff. Sweet stuff. And this week, we're going to touch on a bit more on this topic. First off, I want to ask you, how does, we touch on a lot of like how you are now dealing with relationships and emotions and, the stereotype of being a man. But how do you think these traditional masculine gender norms affects boys or teens on a more societal level or collective level?
I feel like a lot of how the way we were brought up, like culturally aside, like just us as individuals, like the traditional boxes that we've been put in are very misconstrued. And that is really outdated, especially in this day and age, like how we are all brought up. Yes. Because like that is the time, basically when we're children, we're like a sponge, and all the information on all the data that we have accumulated are the water that we have soaked up. So the education system, whether on a parental level or on a societal level, is really, I don't think they're responsible enough to, basically not being responsible enough with like how they convey like the information.
I want to cut in and say something that I've been thinking about a lot.
Sure.
Yes, so true, the educational part. But also, I also find that, and that's something that I've been, reading a lot, and I talk about a lot, which is the domestication of human, where we only know what we know at the time, and we only have the knowledge we know of at the time. So when I look at some of my traumas or things that I have a hard time dealing with, and when I was a child, at first, when I was facing these traumas, I want to blame the people that gave me these information or raised me a certain way. But then I realized they were also domesticated in their ways, and they couldn't control that. They could only tell me what they think was best. So do you think the same goes with the educational system where, yes, 100% it's super outdated, and there needs to be a reform of some sort, but also the way that we were brought up was really the best ability of what our parental knowledge or our educational system or school teachers know to the it was an extent of only what they know and they gave us.
Like going back to that sponge analogy, like sponge, like we don't, like as children and as growing, like when we're growing up, like we're not really, our mind, it hasn't been shaped to a maturity to be aware of the knowledge or data that we are soaking in. So that does take I mean, that's why there's trauma, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of like everything that's embedded into our subconscious as adults now, like all comes from like us, how we were brought up as children, and that, and I feel like now sitting here talking about this particular subject, like we also have that responsibility to sort of break through the norms as well.
And this is the reform that, like, we can do the reform on our own, like as individuals.
Yeah, as individuals for sure, because the individual affects the community, and the community affects the overall system, and the system changes the ecosystem. Yeah.
Wow, so powerful, that whole thing. It's a chain effect for sure.
Yeah, it also ties back to like what we're doing at the studio as well. Like, so one of our taglines on Instagram is to move forward, go full circle. So everything starts on a community level, and the community affects the product. The product will eventually bring change, and the change will lead to a better system. So everything ties in with each other about starting from who we are. Yeah.
That's so powerful, because it really reminds me of this thing that Jane Goodall always says about change. You have to bring about change locally, then you can bring about change globally. Something like that. Not the exact quote, but it really goes back to like, what can I do as an individual that can bring about change in this community, and not just like, I want to change the world, you know? Like when you look at it that far and that advanced and that scaled, it could feel very, very vulnerable. Like you could feel very weak because you don't think you'd be able to achieve these things.
You feel like it's going to be out of your reach.
And I think...
Oh yeah, there's this one thing that I'd like to add, but like these traditional senses of what it means to be masculine, it's like besides it being really, really outdated, it also ties back to like take sports, for example. Like if we talk about sports, like if we talk about basketball, if we talk about football, if someone's like injured while playing that sport, you see this person is physically injured, but it was never really discounted for like how the psychological aspects of that athlete. So it's sort of like that, because as we're going through the motions, like growing up as a male, like we've kept everything internally for so long. Like it was not looked upon. So that's why I feel like for me, I also went through my mental unstableness for quite some time now. I mean, I am getting better. Like I deal with anxiety from time to time, and I sometimes am like go back into that loop of being depressed. But these also, everything adds up, and these are all accumulated through like these traditional like norms that my father or his father has passed down through, generationally.
Yes, for sure. And I think like being born and raised in a patriarchal society, the expectation of men and the continuation to celebrate that stereotypical like image of masculinity is a very harmful and negative impact on male health. Like you said, and it's actually quite refreshing now, or celebratory now, to look at a lot of athletes that take mental illness into consideration for their performance. And, even with Olympic, they taking, mental illness breaks is something that is being seen as a normality now, because we're taking it, because we're normalizing it. We're seeing it as like, yes, that's also something that we can be excused for, and not just physical form, physical illness, physical injuries, etc. And, when we talk about boys and teens, I love to touch on pop culture. And how pop culture influenced masculinity, because I know you dealing with design has a huge influence on pop culture, and how that affects our next generation, or the people like our generation. Yeah. How do you think masculinity and pop culture influence each other?
I think pop culture is very somewhat overrated, and going back to that Sponge reference, like, people aren't mindful or paying attention to the stuff that they put out, because we're in an age where our attention is our currency. So as where each individual / or collective project that is put out into this world is of the utmost importance, because even if you have 6 followers or you have 600 followers, you're still having an influence on the 6 people that follow you, or the 600 people that follow you. So, like, there are cultural projects that stand out to me most, that goes back to the definition of masculinity. Whether it be, so one of my favorite artists is Frank Ocean. And
yes, love him.
Frank Ocean, he did a zine after he released his mixtape called Endless, called Boys Don't Cry. And I that for me is like the perfect example of masculinity. Why I put that into this certain box that should not be like, that should not exist at all, is because, like, basically masculinity is just a societal term that was brought onto us, whether consciously or subconsciously. And that was something we were just taught. If you look like a male, then you're a male. If you're a woman, then you should look like a woman, and you should have long hair. You shouldn't like shave your head or do whatever, Yeah. I think at that time, Frank also came out as gay or bisexual. I can't remember. I think it's bisexual. And that was really a powerful day and age, like the time when he put that out. And then modern day, like, if you look at Euphoria, there's also, I think I'm going on a wild tangent here, but
no, that's fine. Pop culture is a wild tangent. Yeah, like masculinity,
I'm now moving on to like all these, the idea, the concept of gender as a whole. And if you look at Hunter Schafer, I'm not sure if you know who Hunter Schafer is, but she's also she's one of the actresses in Euphoria, who was she's basically trans as well. So I feel like this day and age, everything we do is very powerful. And she's only at the age of 22, and Frank's not even. I can't remember how old Frank is, but these figures in pop culture influence a lot. Like Hunter Schafer would probably influence the next generation of little kids or that look up to her. And Frank has inspired me a lot, like to be vulnerable with where I'm at or the things that I do. And I think that Frank Ocean is a perfect example to talk about vulnerability and emotions, and when it links to culture and race.
because being a black man, traditionally or stereotypically, you're being seen as even more masculine, like in that sense, or even more strong, powerful, competitiveness. And for someone with, with someone who's a BIPOC and coming out, in showing his vulnerability and emotions and coming out with the zine it's so powerful. And we see a lot of that in Hollywood as well, such as Moonlight, the film, which is one of my favorite movie. Yeah. And how it talks about, it's going to be a spoiler alert, but you should watch it anyways, if you haven't seen it, our listeners. But it talks about how a black boy who grew up, his upbringing is in the ghetto, and he struggles with all these issues that the ghetto deals with, or the children of the ghetto deals with. And aside from that, he also struggled with his sexuality and how he identifies himself. And because of the conditioning, the societal pressure, he then have to become, he has to hide, almost mask that part of his sexuality or identity, and to become like a drug dealer that's like, like strong and powerful and like will beat you up, like that identity or stereotype that we see in black men a lot. And it's very heartbreaking film, but it also is the truth and is taught. It shines a light on there definitely are a lot of people like that in our society who aren't able to show their vulnerability in that sense.
Yeah, for sure. And like when I'm talking about Hunter Schafer, when I'm talking about Frank Ocean, like these are figures in pop culture that are, I feel like, are people we need more of. Because pop culture is basically, it's basically money grabbing. They want your money, they want your time and attention. So a lot of the things they put out aren't necessarily as mindful.
Oh, absolutely.
Because pulp culture is the new education system. Kids these days grow up with iPads and TikTok. So that's why I feel like this is the new education system. For me, like this is where they absorb all knowledge and information about where culture and where society is at. Because, kids aren't going to be watching CNN or on Bloomberg,
Yeah. And I think there's pros and cons to this, definitely, when we talk about pop culture and social media. How does Hollywood influence masculinity? Because we all know, how do I say that? We all know that Asian figures or Asian Hollywood stars, like even starting from like what, Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, like those are kind of like the first few, especially in our generation, the first few like Asian faces in Hollywood, and how they have to kind of represent Asian male in Hollywood. And a lot of times, like you see them as like, Jackie Chan's definitely like goofy. Yeah. Bruce Lee is like a very like strength and like a fighter, strong. Like they have to almost like portray themselves as the opposite of what their stereotype is in order to stand out or to shine lights to other people that isn't so knowledgeable about the Asian culture or the Asian people. And how do you see that? How does Hollywood and masculinity go hand in hand or influence each other?
So it's kind of like I feel like this is really really stupid in a way. Like we can look at it like through in two ways, right? So in the past, like how Hollywood would depict like Asian men would usually be through like what you said, like Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee. You would have to have like this amount of strength, or you would have to be this protector of like a household or something. But then you could also look at recent times where films like Crazy Rich Asians are like.
Do you think it shines light on different types of Asian characters?
No, I don't think so. I honestly, like, I say this in full transparency, and I don't think so. Like, I don't really like the film. I don't like Crazy Rich Asians at all. Like, I was like, I'm not trying to be a critique here, but like all these films, like all these films that we watch, I feel like, you know, either you're supposed to be good at math, or you're supposed to be a doctor, or you have X amount of money, and that doesn't really that doesn't really uplift Asian culture as a whole, or Asian masculinity, because it's either like you're a rich Asian dude and you drive a Porsche, or you have a Ferrari, and that doesn't really make sense to me. You know,
it's unrelatable.
Yeah, it's unrelatable, and like
I get what you mean. That it's not about showing up in Hollywood in all different forms or different types of Asian characters. It's about like showing the true like Asian culture, and it's not about like, hey, look, there's Asians who do math, there's also Asians who fight, and there's also, you know, it's another box that we're throwing more boxes into Hollywood to be like, hey, you fill these boxes, you know, but not really like a representation of like what the Asian culture really, really, truly means. And speaking of Hollywood, I've also, you know, when we talk about illusion, it's also a collective illusion.
Yeah.
The foundation or the basis of Hollywood is white people, white celebrities, and not unless we dismantle the entire ground, then we can be like, yes, we can show Asian characters or Asian people in a new light. Because it has always been, Hollywood has been around forever, and this image has already been formed. Asian male actually is one of the most demasculine race in Hollywood.
Yeah, I would somewhat say yes, but also no. But
it's very different from our culture, because our culture expects so much strength in Asian men.
Like I don't really, at the end of the day, like I don't have this emotional resonance with all these boxes. Like all these boxes don't really make sense to me. Like if we talk about whether masculinity or femininity, like all these things are just boxes.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So what if we just strip away all these titles, and I just feel like let's just be, you know, do whatever that you feel is best for you as an individual. And I think that could affect, you know, that is the change we all need on an individual level.
What about change on societal level? Or do you think that change we bring about on an individual and personal level will affect the societal level?
Oh, for sure. Like how you treat the people around you. Our words and actions are contagious. I think just thinking outside the box in general, and not giving into these societal boundaries of, okay, you're this, so go be that. Who
or what inspire your change to think outside the box? Or how can people, like if you were to give advice to people to think outside the box, how do they do that? Because not everyone does that, right?
Yeah.
Like especially when the influence of pop culture and Hollywood and society is so strong. How do you fight against that force?
So who inspired my change is definitely my now girlfriend, Marzi. And she really like throughout the past year, like I've grown like so much.
Yes. And
I've learned so much from her, and I'm extremely grateful for what she has brought into my life. And yeah, mainly her. I think if it wasn't for her, then I wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation with you on this podcast. And I think, you know how there's this saying where it's seeing is believing? I think that's how they say it. Like seeing is believing. But for me in recent times, it's more believing is seeing. And I feel like you have to believe that you are more than enough to inspire change as well within yourself, to see from a global, bigger perspective.
Wow, that's really powerful. I love that. Lastly, I have 2 questions for you. What does masculinity means to you now? If you can sum that up in like 1 to 2 sentences.
Masculinity for me now is simply nothing at all. just nothing. Because like I said, like these are just terms that we were taught growing up, but we just eventually find out that it doesn't really exist
Or matter
at all, because I want to like go back to when I was talking about the Jungian philosophy earlier about the psyche, where the ego is the conscious, and if we dig deeper and down into the subconscious, it's basically what Jung is trying to say is the yin and the yang in Chinese culture. So there's the concept of anima and there's the concept of animus. So basically what this means is that you can never be too masculine or you can never be too feminine. So I identify myself as a male, but then I also have a more feminine side of me. So vice versa. So if you identify as a woman, you also have a level of masculinity within you.
Yes.
That's just who we are. So
true, yeah.
So basically the anima/animus breaks down what it means to be a full masculine man or a feminine woman. And I've had like, for like using me and my girlfriend as putting it into context, like in our relationship, I'm the more feminine one. Like I'm more soft-hearted and I'm more attentive to detail sometimes. I mean, from my perspective, of course, I'm not speaking for her. And she's the more masculine, masculine character in this relationship, even though she has this female form, you know what I mean?
And she still also have a lot of softness and kindness in her.
She does, yes, yeah.
So it, like you said, it's almost like a spectrum.
Yeah, for sure. But then at the end of the day, it all goes back to, you know, just being, you know.
Just be.
Yeah.
Honestly, just be.
Yeah.
And I know it's like such a philosophical or spiritual, if you will, concept to grasp, to be, just be, you know, to say just be. But it really, there's really nothing else you can be than other than yourself, or just be in the moment, be in the now, be in the motions, etc. Last question I have for you: what has more strength, sword or water?
Definitely water. Like for me, it's definitely water. Going back to Bruce Lee, because there's this like interview from, I mean, almost everyone has seen this interview.
Yes.
where he talks about being like water.
Be like water.
Yeah,
my
be
friend.
like water, my friend. And you put water into a cup, a mug, or you like if you put it into a body of, you know, whatever, it could be an ocean, it could be a river, it can be whatever, and it just, you know, flows. And at the same time, it's soft, but it can also drown you and kill you. Yeah.
Yeah, a sword can cut through water, but does no harm.
It does nothing to water. It's very, it's like it's like what we all should strive to be.
And it's like, actually a lot of religious scripts and stories uses water as a metaphor a lot. Even in Siddhartha, the story about Buddha, where he later life became he lived by the river and learned everything he needed to learn through the river, and it's just such a powerful analogy to say that softness actually goes has more longevity. It goes a longer way than
For sure.
than force, than violence. And I mean, you know, we don't want to touch on the war on Ukraine and Russia that's happening right now, but briefly, just as we are talking about this, longevity is definitely love, kindness, and empathy, and that wins the war.
Yeah, that is the way, and it's the only way.
That is the only way. And I'm so happy to have this conversation with you, and to do this 2-part series on male emotions and vulnerability. And of course, we touch on even more and beyond these two topics. But I'd love to have you back to talk about other stuff in the future. And I know we definitely have really great conversations, even, you know, talking about, which we briefly touched on, like spirituality and psychology, and ego. Like, these are really, really big topics, and that we only just touched on. But yeah, I'm so happy to have you. Likewise. And have this conversation. Where can our listeners find you?
On Instagram at Ryan Maeland and dash associates and associates.com.
I will tag all that.
Thank you.
And also, yeah, please give Ryan a follow and check out his studio and associates, which is a very forward-thinking branding studio that uses, identity and spirituality to brand. And you can also follow me at BBT Mommy and sugahoneybbt, sugahoneybbt. That's our Instagram. And you can also subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, pretty much. And that's it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And I'll see you guys next week. Bye.